Ivan Sigal, who is a many talents, photographer. Did I pronounce her name?
Sigal.
Sigal.
Close
Sigal.
enough.
Photographer, writer, media producer, executive director of Global Voices. His work, he's known for work documenting war and conflicts, and has had his work at the Corcoran Gallery and the National Gallery of Art, private collections, and lately he's been a fellow at the Library of Congress, looking at their collections, conflict and political transition. He's going to talk to us about that.
Henry has just arrived. Actually, yeah. So he's there. He just started in September. So it's the same center, the Kluge Center. Okay. So hi everybody. Thank you for taking your time out of your busy days to come listen to me prattle on. I'm going to show you today and talk. This is the first time I'm talking about this work in any kind of public context. So I'm basically, this is like an early workshop for what is a project that I've been working on for about a year, and it's based on like a long-term set of questions and explorations into how we document, how we represent modern conflict, in the many ways that we do that, and how we can start to talk about that representation and what it means for how we understand war. Into the Fold of the True is the working title of this project. It is the phrase comes from a South Vietnamese propaganda film that's part of the Library of Congress collection of about 530 films, propaganda and films on and newsreels from the South Vietnamese, produced by the South Vietnamese in the 1950s and 1960s. And this collection was in the South Vietnamese Embassy in Washington, D.C. when Saigon fell to the north. And as far as we know, it is the sole remaining archive of like the South Vietnamese film industry, like the films produced by the South Vietnamese, because whatever is left now 50 years later that was in South Vietnam when the North took it is unlikely that it survived without care. So maybe there's some remnants floating around somewhere that the North Vietnamese kept, but basically this archive is a body of films that just the libraries had since the South Vietnamese had to close their embassy. And among those propaganda films, some are in Vietnamese, some are in English. There's all these kind of really interesting flowery language around the nature, that kind of accompanies narrative over voiceovers that accompany these films. And as part of this work, I've been pulling phrases out of those voiceovers and clipping the subjects and objects to make kind of evocative language. And Into the Fold of the True is a clipped phrase from a voiceover. One of the things that I've been thinking about in my work is how there's a curious twinning in the history of the development of military technologies and imaging and representative technologies. So as you guys probably know pretty well, like a lot of the major advances in lens development in the 1910s and 1920s had to do with the ability to create better sighting in order to target long-range weapons. And there's been this kind of interesting continual parallel throughout the past century plus of the industrialization of image making and the industrialization of war. And the way that we represent war is, especially in the modern universe of war that includes cyberspace, that includes the occupation of informational zones as much as it is the occupation of physical zones, is that war sits at the level of struggles over perception as much as struggles over materiality. And when thinking about what that all means, and it's easy to get really wrapped up into like questions of things like the Arab uprisings and how we organize ourselves, and we do all that. But I wanted to kind of go back to the very beginning. And the Library of Congress is the place to do that. It has the very first, the complete archives of the very first war photographs from Roger Fenton in 1845. It has all of that material. It has huge collections of World War II, World War I, and Vietnam, and a bunch of other material as well. And it also has, and this is a second part of the work I'm doing, it's a copyright library, which means that it's got really strict terms for how one can use the material there. So I kind of designed a project that would give me, that had kind of two basic directions. One, which is to come up with a justification for how I could access the different archives and the different materials according to their terms, and then to try to push those terms as far as I could in reuse and remix language, and to try to convince the curators and the librarians there to allow me to access those materials under those terms. That includes bulk downloads of the material on they've already digitized. It includes access to a lot of their films that they have not digitized. And then to also kind of explore in a bunch of different ways the taxonomies of image representation of war and how they kind of occult and mystify war through repetition. So my method for doing this grew out of a year and a half long conversation I had with a friend online about a guy named Anton Kusters, who's a conceptual photographer who spent the last 6 years photographing blue skies above every concentration camp in Europe, of which there are 1,078. So we started writing letters to each other back and forth on Instagram about 2 years ago about the nature of memorialization of mass violence. And as part of that, I started visiting war museums around the world and looking at how they represent their archive materials and rephotographing them. So I would go into installations and look at the digital installations. Mostly they are projections and digital reimaginings of conflict zones intended for mass audiences. And there's a whole historicization aspect of it, and there's an entertainment aspect to it, and everything else like that. And as part of doing that, I went to London, I went to Paris, I went to Kiev, I went to Budapest, I went to Hiroshima, and a couple of other places as well. And I started noticing, I thought it would be really great if I could just get my hands on a proper collection rather than having to like sneak in and do this. So this is an example of a projection onto a floor from the Imperial War Museum in London. This is an audiovisual installation in Hiroshima of the dropping of Little Boy, and you can see here this is an amalgamation of an aerial photograph made by the U.S. military of the destruction of Hiroshima with digitally added clouds and explosion functions, which are mostly visible, less visible to the eye than they are to the camera sensor. So these are artifacts, visual artifacts of light that you don't really see with your eye. So these kinds of kind of artifactual functions started to really intrigue me. That's the Library of Congress. And so method. I started working with 4 major collections there, film collections. The first is the South Vietnamese collection, which I already mentioned, and the second 3 are called the captured collections. It's films captured by the U.S. And its allies in World War II from Germany, Japan, and Italy. And they comprise thousands of documentary films, thousands of newsreels, and feature films. And each one of them has a different copyright regime. But in general, the only way you can view them is if you can view them at all, because some of them are original masters, in which case you're not actually even allowed to look at them, though occasionally 1 or 2 got through, and I was able to. And you have to basically, the usual way of reproducing a film like this would be to use an optical step printer, in which you have like a 1-to-1 ratio between the film frame and the reproduction, whether it's a digital or a positive print. in which you basically have a match, a one-to-one match of the object, and that is not possible in this context. They're not going to give you the film to like take it out of the premise and allow you to explore. So it was a big deal just to allow me to use a tripod in this space. That was already a big win. So I eventually kind of set up this very simple structure of using a high quality lens with a small projector on these old viewers that they allow you to use. And very interestingly, the metadata for these collections are pretty fragmented. So what they are is like a pile of old papers in manila folders, and you kind of go through them and you figure out what's in the material, and some metadata and some scholarship on the collections, but not that much. So you kind of have to fight your way through the material, and what's actually on each film you don't know until you make some progress, as opposed to say material that has been organized, and this is the metadata for the Fenton collection that gives you a lot more detail. And what I really wanted to start to do was to create a kind of an alternative or creative metadata layer that looked at taxonomies of image. And my hypothesis is that there's a limited number of ways that we show modern war that accord with both the technologies of war and that accord with the way that we photograph them, and that those ways of depicting war are have pretty much been the same since World War I. They are images of people firing guns, of holding rifles, of firing mortars, images of refugees, images of like portraiture of refugees, soldiers, people getting awards and medals, people standing in front of maps. Like there's about 40 of them. 40 image types that just kind of occur again and again, and they've basically never changed. And they kind of together can create. They're very often about narratives of individuals. So they're about hero narratives in which soldiers seem to have agency in conflict. And that's a really interesting thing, because for most of modern conflict, the most kind of salient factor of it is the lack of agency of soldiers, because ever since we invented automatic riflery, volley guns, and then so on and so forth, the Maxim machine gun, humans haven't stood a chance in war. And yet the predominant narrative form of the telling of war is about human agency. And my contention is that is an intentional mystification of war. And that those of us who photograph in that mode without considering that this is actually part of a larger kind of construction that is about the perception of war are actually partaking in its glorification. So I'm trying to approach those sets of questions through a bunch of different ways. So any questions before I go on, or should I just continue? Good. No. This is just a really quick.
I have one question.
Yep,
Do you have an inkling if that's changed with social media? So now it's not professionals, but others that depict war?
It has started to change in really interesting ways, and I think we'll get into that towards the end. Certainly, things like collected archives of conflict, where we've seen everything from like 18 Days of Egypt type projects to work on digital forensics, the works of folks like Bellingcat and Situ Research and Forensic Architecture and all of those other people who are thinking about, there actually aren't that many of them, but groups that are thinking about how to depict the structure, like violence as structural, and what it means to show that, and what it means to explain it in ways that are, to create a narrative around what structural violence is, which is often very different from a traditional linear narrative form. So that's just a very quick shot of what the 16mm films looks like that I'm playing with. So the next thing I tried to do was to come up with a theory of the case for how to describe this kind of work as a way to free it from copyright. Of course, we have the classic Richard Prince type examples of what constitutes fair use, but that doesn't fly with a library. So I'm trying to come up with I came up with a theory that is maybe a little bit slightly more rigorous than a fair use case. And the term I'm using is an interpolated image. Interpolation, as we all know, is the two top definitions are definitions that are, the first one is the kind of layperson's definition, and the second is the mathematical definition, a method of constructing new data points within a discrete set, or the insertion of something of a different nature into something else. And the definition that I'm using here is slightly metaphorical, but it's an object made from elements of a set yet existing nowhere in that set. And so it sits adjacent to the set of existing images, and yet it is not made, actually doesn't actually constitute an image that you can find in the set. And that should theoretically, hopefully that will be enough to free it from its constraints. At least that's my theory, that's my argument. I'm interested in whether or not you guys can find that to be valid or not. You know, it is a lower bar than what Richard Prince used and others, so we'll see. So here's 3 examples of how that manifests themselves in image making. So the first is the depiction of moire. So the image sits in the background, and this is basically a picture of a screen with the object sitting behind it, and the focus is on the screen. The second is capturing the interleaving of different images that don't exist as actual images in the film. And the third is allowing temporality to seep into the images, so long exposures of film that's running past you. And there's lots of other ways of doing that, but basically those are just test cases. So with that, I've started to use that as a framework for how I'm making images in the collections that I'm working with. And I started sort of systematically rephotographing films in those 4 collections. And so far I've got about 10,000 images. And I'm starting to build objects, digital and like collage type objects out of that material. So taxonomies. So I made a set of claims before about how war is represented, but that narrative of war, the structural depiction of violence versus the narrative hero-based depiction of violence, has 2 distinct historical threads. Yes.
I was just, before we move on from the interpolation thing.
Sorry?
Before we move on from the interpolation, I was wondering, so like Trevor Piglin is doing this thing where he'll have these huge databases of images, and he'll use machine learning, and then he'll generate new images that are sort of like those images, but none of them, they're not actually in the set.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if that's a way to potentially do an end run around the copyright stuff and be like, oh, what I'm going to do is I need all 10,000 images or 10 million images because I'm going to train this machine learning system to produce a new image which isn't there, but I need them all to do that.
That totally works, yeah. And one of the objects that I'm hoping to make out of this actually is a trained AI that is then set into the wild and finds these images using the new taxonomies that I'm building. That's like if I'm actually able to get far enough in the work, then I would try to do that, yeah. So exactly, it's a way of using the entire set to make something new that doesn't exist inside of the set. So really quickly, this may be old hat for many of you. This is Roger Fenton's the first image of war, 1846. Cannonballs on a field of battle. Yeah. And this is the first example of basically landscape photography in war, which is the origin point for all structural depictions of images that attempt to depict structural violence. The second is, of course, most of Fenton's work is actually just men sitting on horses. Very little bit, or officers sitting around, and that had a lot to do with the technology of the day when it took 3 minutes to make an exposure, or 5 minutes to make an exposure. And this is how the library collects that. I put together a little Python script to scrape what I could of the library's digital collections, and so there's a way to automate the downloading of their materials, and that's another part of my process. The searches are hard, but anyway, this is what you get with how the Fenton collection is depicted. The second narrative thread, of course, is with the advent of small cameras and kinetic action. And this has really been the dominant mode of narrative about war since the Spanish Civil War. As I said already, in the kind of initial exploration of the films that I've looked at, I found about 35 different taxonomies of images that are repeated again and again, and I've started to build like processing-based, using the computer language processing to build prototypes of how to start to show that work. So this is a screenshot of the first prototype, which I'll show towards the end, which is just there's 8 different categories in a central image. And these categories are landscapes, refugees, flags, officials sitting in front of tables, and soldiers running, and I believe the last one is wounded civilians. So some of the typical types of images that you'll see are wounded soldiers, many pictures of those, flag scenes. Everybody's got a flag, of course. This is rather prosaic, right? Hero shots, very common. For soldiers and peasants, they get hero shots from below. Prisoners of war are always shot from above on the ground. The Germans did it, the Americans did it, Japanese did it. Signing documents, very popular. Men standing in front of maps. Many pictures of men standing in front of maps. So at a certain point, you're like, okay, what does that all mean, right? That's nice, Ivan, you know, very good. But then there also starts to be kind of weirdness and strangeness that creeps into these images the more you look at them. And one of the things that always happens, I'm sure as you all know, when you start a project is it takes you in a direction you didn't expect. And I keep getting drawn into the stories in ways that are, I'm trying to resist the pull of the stories, but they're there, and it's like, ah! So some of the things I've started to make are actually embedded in those stories as well. And a lot of times it's things like the interaction of the film, the destroyed film, with the story underlying image. So a refugee train and kind of a thought bubble created by the cracking of the film, or some of the kind of more unusual artifacts that you see in just in some of the taxonomic images. So this is many pictures of people firing guns, and yet you still find objects or moments of fascination in those kinds of images, or like images of high abstraction. So when you actually look at the composition of the many scenes of battles at night, you start to get kind of almost hallucinatory images that come out of them. The next step was to take those kinds of those taxonomies and to start to make repetition models out of them. So here are just a couple of examples of those repetition forms. So planes falling and being shot out of the sky, or the firing of volley guns, or repetitions of, like, this is a tower built in South Vietnam to celebrate a festival that was related to development of the South. And the next thing is to start to make animations, reconstructed animations of the films. And this is American soldiers arriving in South Vietnam. And at this point, I started to think about kind of artfully deranging the images to kind of play directly into the occultification or mystification, and to use that framing to kind of run towards it rather than to try to run away from it in its taxonomy. So in a lot of the films, there's a lot of the propaganda, there's a fascination with physical health. And the pivotal moment is the 1936 Olympics in all of the World War II newsreels. And so this is Jesse Owens. This is from a Japanese newsreel of Jesse Owens winning long jump in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And it's a reconstructing of it, like a deranging of it. Each one of these is actually in the film itself. So it's a collage form of that moment. in a way that is like looking at the film as well as at the event. And this last one is another example of a story that kind of sits in that space. This is from a German newsreel, also from 1936, that shows, that's kind of potentially going to take me in a different direction entirely. This is the New York National Guard performing a demonstration of how they would control a communist, control tear gas and machine gun a communist demonstration in the United States. Performed for the German newsreels. So, you understand what I just said, right? This is the New York National Guard creating a fictional communist suppression of a communist demonstration for a German newsreel that was then broadcast in Germany. So this is, and so this is some of the things that I'm finding as I go further into the archives, and which make me think that like a lot of my initial premises I might end up somewhere quite far away from some of those initial ideas about taxonomies and structures and things like that. So I don't know if I can show, I have a digital object as well, a processing-based program that does which like runs these images in different sort of random forms together with sound, but I'm not positive I can get it to play this way. So because it's kind of screen specific, so it may or may not work, and if it doesn't, I can show you guys later on my computer. That ends the formal part of this talk. So I have lots more pictures to show and lots of things I can dig into, and I'll simply maybe mention really briefly that there have been lots of interesting ways digitally to try to reimagine analog archives for scholarship. A very prominent one that you all may know about is the Photogrammer project at Yale's Digital Humanities that took and built metadata structures and maps for all of the WPA images. That's this, which is a much more kind of academic approach to dealing with large archive formations. And you can spend a lot of time playing around with that. And I initially thought, well, maybe I'll do something like this. And then I just decided to move more towards the kind of the forms of expression rather than the forms of archive. But there is that whole conversation to be had, and it's pretty interesting. So, and of course the Archive of Modern Conflict, which is a London-based group that collects, is what it sounds like, and then uses those archives as ways to make objects, books, invite scholars to do research on the topic, and so on and so forth. So I'll stop there for a moment. Yeah.
I'm interested in this last one that you showed, of course, with the New York State going to Germany.
Mm-hmm.
How many of the things that you found were for audiences outside of the cultural context that it was being portrayed? Like, people are photographing their heroes to try and, valorize what they're doing, right? But how often is it being sent abroad or being sent to another context, cultural context?
I think quite often.
Okay.
So in the South Vietnamese case, for example, those films, because they were living in the South Vietnamese Embassy in Washington, D.C., one can assume, I think fairly, that all of the major South Vietnamese embassies probably had those kinds of collections, because that was how you showed, that was the process for showing what was occurring at that time. So I'm sure that the Vietnamese embassy in Paris and London also had a collection of these kinds of propaganda films, and they were dubbed into English. So some of them were for the local Vietnamese, like there to inform the embassy staff, and some of them were made explicitly for an American audience and overdubbed and had this kind of propagandistic narrative function. Like there's a really fascinating one about the Battle of Hue, which is for those of you who don't know much, don't dig into the history of the Vietnam War. The Battle of Hue was a pivotal battle in which the North Vietnamese showed that they could best South Vietnamese and their American supporters, and held that city for a long period of time, and then gave it up only with massive casualties on both sides. And the way that story is told is very, very, very lopsided, of course. The German, Italian, and Japanese material is fascinating because they also are still in the 1930s and even through the 40s. The newsreel companies are talking to each other and they're sharing footage, and so you're getting like clips from American cinematographers in the German Feuilleton newsreels, and you're getting like French footage. So it's like there's still active conversation between all of those parties, and so the idea that the Germans are out, in the night, the classic film that we have at that time is Leni Riefenstahl's work on Berlin, but there's lots and lots of other material happening at that time as well, and there's lots of sharing. And so in the German films I've seen so far, there's a lot of footage about America, shot in America for German audiences. And some of that's shot by Americans, some of that's shot by the Germans. There's like a great one, which is there was a massive fire in Chicago in 35 or 36 that burned down the stockyards. And that's like gets a prominent, that has a prominent display in one of the films. And I think that the Germans were probably also showing that material to ethnic German populations in America. One of the pieces that I found is there was a trade embargo against the Germans in the late 30s from America, and there was a protest in Madison Square Garden of ethnic Germans. Something like 10,000, thousands and thousands of ethnic Germans showed up in Madison Square Garden to protest the trade embargo. And so those kinds of events were happening throughout the 30s with some pretty significant support. It wasn't just Charles Lindbergh. There were lots of others who were in favor of either staying neutral or tacitly supporting the Germans. So you see that material. There was also, I found footage of the Japanese naval fleet on the mall in Washington, D.C., being given honors, and this is in 1936. So this was after they'd already invaded Manchuria. And here they are, American and Japanese flags side by side on the mall in front of the Washington Monument. So those kinds of narratives, those are the things that I'm like, there's actually a whole historical element to kind of unearth about our common assumptions about what fascism is and how the Americans related to it. And so I might end up actually digging into that quite a lot as well. I think I'm not nearly done with there's just so much material. And you guys know once you start opening a door into an archive, you're like, 10 years later, you're like, here I am, still in the archive.
So much war.
I know, so much war. Yeah.
Are you finding animation or other kinds of techniques in these archives as well?
There's a lot of posters. I haven't seen much animation yet. I mean, there's some at the beginning of clips, you'll see sometimes animated maps and things like that. But you're not seeing extensive Disney type animation, or at least I haven't yet, not in this material. Yeah.
About sort of the pedagogical value of displaying side by sides of so you give the example of everybody does X, so they all shoot the POWs from above on the ground, they all shoot the soldiers from below. Just imagine sort of grid displays of here's the same technique used by 50 different nation states, and that being something that could be really valuable in having conversations with students or the general public about war and narratives about war and propaganda.
Yeah, that was, with the grids that I was showing, I had that was kind of one of the ideas that I kind of imagined I could do. And then I also had this moment of fear in which, in doing that, I would be accused of equating democracy with fascism. One could read it or one could read a collage of that sort as trying to making a statement of moral equivalence. And maybe there is a statement of moral equivalence there, but you can also imagine it being read in interesting ways. So I have thought about that, and I've thought about the conversations that it could kind of ensue. Yeah.
I think the whole historic view on depicting war would be super useful for places like World Press Photo and Magnum. Like,
Mm.
I've had a lot of discussions in those two forums where I've said, you know, it's not worth it these days just to go out and document war, because we know what it looks like. I mean, we know, and now I'm realizing we know like one way of how it looks like, but the argument there is, you know, we need to document it because it's happening, and it could be really interesting to inject those findings into that discourse.
Yeah, Magnum and the World Press Photo folks are they're the primary ideological drivers of the continuation of the kinetic view of war, the narrative of war, which is primarily told through human experience, which is not to say that human experience is not important, but when that is the dominant mode of seeing war, then we don't ever see that war is actually deeply embedded in all of our processes of peace. It's the intentional occultification of it is, and the insistence that it's about human narratives as opposed to industrial processes, allows us to, I think in a lot of ways it gives us all a pass, because we don't, when you go to a war zone these days, what you do is you experience the closer you get to it, you experience the intentional stripping away of layers of civilization until you get to a place where a certain kind of behavior is permitted. And so if you go, for instance, to the Ukrainian front today, you used to be able to go, in 2016 I went to a city called Mariupol, which sits 20 kilometers from the front line. It's the largest port city that the Ukrainians still have. It has 2 massive steel plants. It's basically Ukraine's version of Bethlehem or Johnstown. And part of the industrialized world since the late 19th century, when those plants were built and financed by international capital. In order to get there, it used to be like a hour flight from Kiev. Now it's a no-fly zone, so you have to drive 6 hours, pass through these increasingly heavy checkpoints until you get to a zone of relative safety within the city, but then you can't move outside of the city more than 5 kilometers without bumping into like the barriers, the forms that keep you outside, and then you can hear the war every night. It's like only 20 kilometers away, so you have this kind of crazy proximity to a conflict zone. And those of you know that like you actually have to remove civilizational functions from a conflict zone in order to participate in it. And that's an industrial. Those are all like industrial processes that we build and then remove. So, yeah.
It's also interesting because the huge discussion in those forums, Magnum and World Press and the likes, have been about photoshopping images, and really the manipulation starts way before that. So
That's right. Yeah, the larger issue is about the choice to continually photograph in a certain way, and to create a context in which there is both the hero narrative of the image maker tied to the hero narrative of the soldier, and they are paired, and all of the stuff about young men and honor and blood and all of those narratives are basically us. Not for the people who are living them. Undoubtedly, there's truth in there, but that's also a misdirection from the larger industrial and political world that we're living in. So.
That does point to equivalence, and to connect these two. I mean, it strikes me that professionalization it's a very delicate thing to expose, but if you can expose it, it suddenly makes clear why certain shots are always from certain angles, no matter what the culture, or why this taxonomy that you're proposing is the case. I mean, from the electronics industry side, in this same period, I find the post-war interviews striking, where German engineers, radio and television engineers, are being interrogated by their American counterparts, and it's sort of like, hey, we were colleagues 6 years ago, and now I'm interrogating you. But
Right.
It's basically, hey Hans, how did you solve that? We were working with silicon. What were you using? And it's professional swapping of tales,
Yep.
but identical agendas put to different ends. So I think that if you can somehow bring that professional, that sort of surface that neutralizes it all for both sides and makes it that's being an articulate.
That is an interesting way of talking about it, and that would have to go into like the culture of the newsreel companies, and how they depict themselves. I mean, the opening frame of the Japanese newsreel shot, for instance, has this kind of whole like professionalization aura around it. It's like a man sitting in front of the camera, turning in a certain way, and it's got a certain kind of, it's instantly recognizable, and as being this kind of proud of the profession, proud of the craft of making these objects.
And the really distinct modalities of it. I think in Germany's case, there's a guy named Colin Ross, I don't know if you've come across him, travelogue, popular travelogue writer and filmmaker in Germany, but whose base is in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically ships over a big Mercedes and does these endless, crisscrosses the US a bunch of times. This is until America is engaged with war, so this is after 39. And, but basically it's propaganda and also spy mission. He goes to a lot of harbors and films a lot of stuff. But it's all kind of recycled into newsreels that are shown in German cinemas. And I wonder if there are American counterparts doing that in Germany. But that's
Yeah.
another kind of interesting thing.
I expect there were. Yeah, I expect so.
I like the little fact that he needs to bring a Mercedes. He can't drive an American car.
No, and it's weird when he has to get it fixed. I mean, interesting case there. But he writes novels about it. He writes a weekly column in a newspaper and magazines. He's a very heavily documented guy.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Have you managed to analyse contemporary imagery as well?
I haven't. I mean, I would like to, and I definitely have done like a lot of informal analysis of contemporary imagery made by professional photographers for the last 30 years. I mean, so I'm pretty conversant in that body of work. Everything, you know, the World Press photo type work that Bjarke has mentioned, or the Pulitzer Prize winning awards. So there's that kind of anything that comes out of Perpignan, the Perpignan Photo Festival, which is like the place that war photographers go to hang out in southern France every summer. So there is that universe of people who make images that way, which is actually in pretty striking contrast to the way that images are made in the citizen space, because sometimes you see people like in the professionalization mode, people are driving towards those kinds of images, and they're actively seeking to replicate those taxonomies or those kind of genre images, right? And there's minor variations on them, but year on year, they basically produce the same kinds of things, which is why we say, you know, why we have this kind of endless. I think we as viewers are also exhausted by the repetition of those types of images that never seem to move beyond a certain kind of fairly predictable narrative flow, especially as the widespread practice of embedding photographers and journalists into militaries has become more prevalent, and as those militaries have achieved the authority over which images are actually going to be used or published in the press.
And have you talked to the press at all about the kind of work that you're finding? Because I mean, I work for a large newspaper, and it would be really interesting for you to talk to the people who are picking the pictures, because I'm sure that they're just doing this very quickly without any reason about, you know, any understanding of the kind of bias in the imagery that is.
I mean, I think it varies. I mean, certainly there are photo editors that I've talked to who are super aware of this and are trying to push back against it in some ways, and then there's others who are like the reason it's happening. They're assigning stories. They're picking images that are based on, you know, both on what they think is how they think the war should be represented, and on how they think those images will play with the story that they're working on, and on whether or not they think there will be traffic that goes to it. So there's a lot of elements involved in that. They're certainly deeply invested in this, in the perpetuation of this kind of image making. They are deeply invested in it. Yes, in my experience. One of the things I often find when I talk to them about alternative ways, like ways of showing structure, is that those types of images are too conceptual. So I had the work that I did on Mariupol, I published it with Creative Time, which is a New York-based nonprofit public arts space. And before that, I had taken it to Foreign Policy, and the first editor I talked to said, "Oh, this is fascinating, I'd love to publish it. And she bumped it up to her senior editor, and they said, no, this work is too conceptual. There's not enough people in it. And so you often get that. There's not a strong enough narrative kind of through line. It's not character driven. You get that a lot. Al Jazeera, I got the same thing from a photo editor in Al Jazeera about a different project. It has to be character driven for them to publish it. That was their model for documentary, whether still or filmic.
Have you seen the trophy camera?
I haven't.
So there's these guys who created a trophy camera. They basically took a data set of 60 years of well-pressed photo images, and then when you take a photo, it guides you to take the one that would be likely to get a well-pressed photo award.
That's great. That's brilliant.
I'll send you the
Funny.
link.
That's really great. But one of the things I want to, it's one thing to critique those communities, and what I found is that those critiques don't really work. Like just saying that's a problem, we need to change it. There's no one to address that critique to, because the structure of the news industry isn't such that there's like a decision maker in any one place. It's a distributed authority problem. And so figuring out how to change that is, just saying, oh, it's bad, and look at this, that's a didactic approach. And what I'm trying to do is come up with ways of kind of playing against type and showing other ways of seeing, rather than, which is in a way harder, because it's easy to say this is bad. It's harder to say, let's try this,
I wondered if there's any culture around putting body cameras on soldiers the same way that there is around the police now, because it seems like body cam images are really revealing systems of oppression at this conceptual level. And I was curious if there was any way of getting around the professionalization of these images in war.
So the other aspect of the genre image that professional war type photographers are really invested in is the iconic image, valorization, and the lifting up of images that are claimed as iconic in some form, and that what that means in its rough form, as we all know, is images that when I say remember that image, everybody 30 years later is like, oh yeah, I know that image. And I think the last image made by a professional photographer in that vein, though, was probably Somalia, in which the American soldier is dragged through the streets of Mogadishu in 1992, 93, or maybe the Bosnian, maybe the '94 Bosnian case of Srebrenica. Since that time, any image that has kind of scaled to achieve virality that I can think of has been made by a participant. So Abu Ghraib. There are very few of them. It's very, very hard. It's very unusual for any image to achieve iconic status at this point. The news industry has tried to make a couple of images made by professionals iconic in the last couple of years. So the one that's probably come closest to being successful is of the little Syrian child on the beach in Turkey. Arguably it's been turned into cartoons and things like that. But most of the other images that have achieved some kind of symbolic character have been made by civilians. And sometimes they're partaking of the same tropes, image-making tropes that professionals use, and sometimes not. The Abu Ghraib images are strange and uncanny and totally fucked up, right? When you actually look at those pictures, they're not pictures that a professional would make. And that they derive their power from that, I think. Not only from that, but in part from that, because they are somehow naive in their quality. There are other examples. The 2009 Iranian Green Movement resulted in an image of a woman named Neda who had been, you guys still remember that, right? Interesting, 10 years later almost. So her portrait achieved that quality. That image was made by a doctor who was trying to save her. So those kinds of things, I don't know if it's possible to say that those images are really different, because at the end of the day, we're still all using cameras. We're all still learning how to use an apparatus that's showing us what the best way to take a picture is. And some of the questions I have are around, like, can we start to build filters that show us in different ways of making images? Because a lot of the ways that we make filters now are actually playing off of those kinds of visual histories, like the, you know, whether it's old film stocks or whether it's other things like that. Yeah.
One, you see, can you go back to talking about your work with processing? And I'm kind of curious about how you're thinking about displaying some of this work and like what form it might take, because it doesn't sound like it might be like a book, or it might be like an installation, or what are you thinking about there?
I'm thinking about it as an installation or a series of installations, and I'm working towards 2 shows next year. So I've got a big show in a small place that nobody's going to see next March. So I've got basically taking over a museum in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but fortunately nobody's going to see it. So I can basically experiment in that space, and then I've got a smaller show at the University of Pennsylvania next September. So I've got like installations to build. Let me see if I can get the processing program to play on the other screen.
Would it help just to mirror it temporarily?
I can try it. I mean, processing is funky that way, so let me see. Otherwise, I can show it to you later.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, maybe it doesn't work. That's kind of warped. No, it's not going to work. Sorry. No, sorry, I'll show it to you later.
Okay. Yeah.
Mhm.
Have you analyzed images that are being used by the military to make decisions? Not like images to represent war, but images used by military to make decisions about who to target, or aerial imagery, drone imagery, like that kind of, how they create evidence through images.
I've looked at this question around World War I and World War II. And there's a huge body of knowledge around it in terms of like the modern drone warfare, which is it's a fascinating topic, and I've done a fair amount of reading on it, but I haven't myself gone and had the experience of what that feels like. I would love to have a chance to do that. The World War I and World War II phenomenon of imaging and targeting is really fascinating, though. It's really all about aerial photography. At that time, it's about like building planes that are designed specifically to capture aerial images that then can be used to create, which are mapped onto grids and then brought back to headquarters that are used to target long range rifle rockets. And there are these fascinating cameras that were made in the 40s that look like machine guns, and they are designed. And they're really, really cool. I wonder if I can find one.
They look like, or they're disguised as?
It's kind of hard they look like them. Maybe they're disguised as, but they certainly look that way. So the U.S. Navy Fairchild aerial gun camera. Let's see if I can find one. No.
Harkens back to Bray, his rifle camera. To get sequential images.
Mm-hmm.
1890s.
Gatling.
How to show a bird in flight or
Wow.
pre-film.
Yeah.
There's a lot of satellites that are saying that they're doing, exoplanet research, but they're actually, disguised. I mean, just the concept of them is disguising what they're doing, spying on Russia or whatever, right? It's the same concept.
This will work out. Just work on this. Where does the film spool? It looks like an incredibly small cartridge for. Maybe the Mickey Mouse here is going on top.
Yeah.
The Germans were doing a lot of experimental work with high-def television, 2,000 line television, for live aerial reconnaissance, so they wouldn't have to like process it, take it back, grid it, they could just shoot it down. So are you interested in we've spoken about the iconicity of images, and some of that's maybe the image, some of it's maybe the editors, and a lot of it's the distribution. Are you looking at what gets out at the reception side of what's really circulating in the press? And I ask because I've been doing some work on wire services in the 19th century and transatlantic cable in particular. And there's a bunch of projects like the Viral Text Project that basically any digitized newspaper, I mean, you put in a phrase and it will tell you which of the zillion newspapers it pops up in. I imagine that's doable for images as well.
I mean, if the metadata is good enough, then yes. I mean, well, there's two ways to try to do that. Well, one is through metadata, through captioning, and the other is through like an AI that can act, machine readable imagery, and that's getting closer. So I've started looking. The other thread I've been investigating is whether any of the tools, the Amazon, the Google, the other image recognition systems are good enough to start to interpret some of these images. So. Because in order to build the taxonomy, you first have to come up with a precise enough set of training data that's when you set it free, it actually sees what you want it to see. When I thought about it initially, I thought, oh, it's going to break, and it's going to break in really interesting ways. So it'll start to see images in popular culture, and and we'll see, and maybe it will show us that we kind of remake these images all the time in different ways, but. You'd have to be pretty precise about how you choose those image characteristics, or else it's just going to look like everything. But the scholarly approach of like actually digging into the materials produced by publications, or that would be another way to do it. Of course, so that's a lot. It's pretty intensive work to do, but it is possible. I mean, one of the fascinating topics there I looked at a while ago is. Representations of U.S. military soldiers killed or wounded in combat. And the embedding system has basically removed most of those images from circulation. So there's something like 6 or 8 images from the 2003 Iraq War of American soldiers, only 6 or 8 images of American soldiers that were killed. That kind of escaped the censorship regime of the U.S. military. And in comparison to the thousands of images of Iraqis, killed, and if that's not a power imbalance, I don't know what is. And there is a universe of people in this country, of course, who don't want their sons and daughters dead depicted, and maybe they're right, but there is not an equivalent force on the other side. Yeah.
2 questions. One is like continuing the thread about sort of algorithmic selection and so on, and I'm wondering about as newsrooms start to use more and more sophisticated techniques to select, maybe even in real time, the images that will be that will circulate. I'm wondering how that might relate to the work that you're doing. So as there's algorithmic editorial decision making happening, presumably that's going to reproduce these same frames, these same dominant modes of displaying war, and the systems will be continually learning to reproduce the same thing. And so I'm wondering whether there's a place to intervene in that. And the second question is about whether you encountered significant images of anti-war protest in these archives, and how that might relate to the larger question.
So for the first one, that's a really interesting question, and I think the first thing I think about is the way that we treat images in the news as single objects in which they kind of have a completeness and narrative to them. So whether when you make an image for the news, you tend to need to build narrative into the image itself, or it's a close-up or a portrait in which the metadata, the text, the accompanying text is describing what you're seeing, but they need to stand alone. And so the way that, which is really different from the way that we treat images in networks, in like network societies. In network societies, images achieve their meaning in the context in which they are found. Their meaning, they don't have meaning without the contextualization of them, and that, like, as with so many other things in network societies, right? And the way that the news industry treats images is a singular. I mean, you can't have an iconographic image without that process. The editing selection requires that it achieve a kind of a symbolic status. And I think that the AIs that we look for will be seeking to replicate that way of seeing. So one way of counter programming it is to think about, like, almost like a provocation to build a way of using context to, like, completely alter, like, build different context to completely alter the way we would kind of put images together to understand what they mean, whether that's changing the metadata or like other like narrative forces that aren't necessarily the dominant framing or agenda setting of the news outlets in the first place, because that's where it starts, right? It starts with the frame that the news outlet brings to the story. In any given day, you're going to get 3. In any different conflict, there's like 2 possible narrative structures, and anything more complicated sits uneasily with that telling. If you try to tell a different story, it doesn't fit within their frame, and they won't publish it. And so the framing aspect is probably pretty key. In terms of the peace movement, I have yet to encounter. Well, that's not true. There's so far there's a couple of South Vietnamese films about the Buddhist protests. That were probably sanctioned at a certain point, because at the end of the day they were successful. So I doubt that there's much, there's like the monks burning themselves and that kind of thing that achieved a scale, a global scale of visibility. But so far I haven't seen much that's kind of countering to the national narratives. Lots of pictures of like German children singing and dancing and going to summer camps, and lots of equivalent in Japanese and Vietnamese spaces.
And that raises interesting questions about sort of like the selection process and the larger conversation you're trying to have about the representation of war. Because in popular culture, those images, I don't know, it depends on the context, I guess, but in certain times and places, certainly the counter protester images have circulated very widely, and some times and places have been some of the dominant imagery to represent a war or a conflict, though that's not what's in the national archives of the conflict itself.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what's happening in popular culture.
Certainly in Vietnam, from Vietnam onward, that's been true. I think before Vietnam, it's pretty rare. And even until probably 2/3 of the way through the Vietnam conflict, that was not the case, right? And it was driven by, there are histories on that talk about attempts from alternative filmmakers in the Vietnam case to get their materials onto the national broadcasters and failing to do so. And really, Walter Cronkite drove that, right? It wasn't until the big broadcasters opened up space in their programs for alternative narratives. So it was a top-down process to allow other narratives into the frame. And that happened once there was a shift in cultural mood. But once it happened in Vietnam, it's since that time, at least in the American context, that narrative has been there. Yeah, and once we've had more channels, it's been obviously more and more there in more and more different ways.
And even just sticking to the battlefield in that Vietnam case, it's interesting because there's been some writing about how the guys in the field shooting are significantly younger than the people that have to send the tapes to the States, for the film to the States, and then there's an editorial process, and it's a very different generation of people who then weed out. I mean, that's where I think sort of looking at what actually gets out versus what is in the archive as being shot is an interesting thing to look at. And at least in the Vietnam case, there's a fair amount of testimonies that suggest that what was being shot was not.
What was being, right, the editing was very heavy but the framing was being done back in the newsroom.
And it was a generational
A
issue.
generational shift too. That totally makes sense. Yeah. I mean, it is a really interesting kind of approach. I need a research assistant. Wow. I'm not really a combat photographer. I have photographed a little bit of war. And the first war I photographed was the end of the first Chechen War in 1996. And it was kind of a defining moment for me because I went to a Red Cross hospital and I photographed amputations and people recovering and so on and so forth. And 2 weeks after I did that, I went, the 6 of the doctors and nurses in that hospital were murdered in their beds. And I spent like 5 days with them. So I went and I called up the New York Times, and I was printing in their office in Moscow, so I knew the correspondents there at the time. And I said, I have pictures of these guys, their lives, so are you interested in it? Sorry, I called up the Time magazine photo editor who was in Moscow, and they still had a photo editor in Moscow in those years. And I said, are you interested in these pictures, the day in the life type photographs of these people? It was pretty rare at that time for Red Cross workers, for humanitarian people to be targeted in conflict. And the photo editor said to me, do you have pictures of their funerals? Because we're not really interested in their lives, we're only interested in their deaths. And that crystallized for me why I didn't, what I didn't want to do. And that was the end of my photojournalism or photography career. Thankfully. I'm glad he gave me that lesson. As you know, and 20 years later, he was a photo editor at Al Jazeera, and he's still we only do narrative-driven work. I'm like, man, that's your beat. Anyway, of course, not everybody's like that, and the world is not as narrow. I mean, there are no longer. In the 90s, there were 30 photo editors, in the world, determining what most of us saw, right? Because that was driven by a very strong hierarchy in terms of what images we saw in the mass media space. And now, all of the really fascinating possibilities for thinking about how to depict structural violence have to do with the distributing the image maker, whether it's cameras on cops or cameras on soldiers or ways of imagining data and tying data into, or trying to track industrial chains of industrial product, and looking at how industry sits with war and how those things tie together, and ways to visualize what's hard to see as a process, and that can only be done by distributing the means of image making. So I do think there are ways to do it that are really fascinating. Anyway, so hopefully the pictures will also be good at some point. Yeah, that's what I got.
Well, thanks very much.